It's looking at people, prosperity, and planet.
Hello, I'm John Rossi. I'm a touring drummer with a passion for animal conservation. When I'm on the road, I spend as much time as possible visiting zoos, aquariums, and conservation organizations. Now, I want to share those places with you. I'll be talking to keepers, vets, conservationists, anyone who can help me in my mission of connecting my people to animals through their people. Join me on my Rossifari. Hello, and welcome back to an episode of the Rossifari podcast that's going to be a little contradictory to something that you've heard on here recently. I am really excited to tell you about today's episode, but first, I'm going to pause and tell you that it is, time to make some quick reminders. So hop on to Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Rossifari. Make sure you're following along. On TikTok, it's at Rossifari Pod. And also you can become a patron of the podcast and help support the podcast for as little as $3 a month by going to patreon.com/Rossifari. One of the bonuses of being a patron of the pod is that you get bonus audio from some of the episodes, including this one. And this episode. I every once in a while something happens with this podcast and I'm just like, well, that worked out pretty well. And this is one of those times. So way back in August, you may remember that I went to the AZA conference in Baltimore. And while I was there, a good friend of me and the pod, Katie Propp, introduced me to Chelsea Wellmer. Chelsea works for the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, a really cool organization that you're going to hear a lot about in this episode. And we connected and we wanted to set up an interview and, things get in the way as they do sometimes. And so just recently I was able to sit down here and finally do my interview with Chelsea. Now, while that was happening and we were trying to figure out how to make this work, I got an email from a PR person asking me if I'd be interested in interviewing Leif Cox from the Orangutan Project. And I said, yes, of course. And in that interview, Leif mentioned that he does not believe that there is such a thing as sustainable palm oil, and that palm oil really isn't the villain that the conservation community has made it out to be. That was especially shocking to me, given that Leif cares so much about orangutans, which are kind of the poster children for why palm oil is a problem. And it also set up very nicely my interview then with Chelsea Wellmer, who will discuss her views on what Leif said. It's not one is right and one is wrong kind of thing, although I do tend to think that what Chelsea says in here makes a lot of sense. But to me, it also is just a great illustration of how hard conservation is. There are so many different elements that go into this and so many people involved and so many organizations that have the same goal maybe, but different approaches and all that kind of stuff. And I love whenever a topic like that comes up on the podcast. And so, I'm really excited about this because at the end of the day, you've got two people who are both working very hard to save orangutans, who both believe that they are doing the right thing and can explain it and why they think that is the case. And you kind of get to decide what you think about all of it. I do think it's interesting. Chelsea does agree with some of what Leif said, so you will get to hear that. There's a lot of nuance in the discussions that go into conservation. And, again, that's something that often gets lost in like online debates and discussions and such. So you'll get to hear that. You'll get to hear exactly what the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil is, a kind of just really cool look at how I think conservation should be done in a lot of ways. You'll get some animal stories. Chelsea has worked as a zookeeper. You'll even get to hear some shout outs of people that you know and love from the podcast, like Mark and Colleen at Cincinnati and Katie Prop, of course. So yeah, lots of good stuff. I'm looking forward to sharing this interview with you, and so I'm going to do that now. So without further ado, here is my interview with Chelsea Wellmer of the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. All right, and we are recording. Yay. That's my podcast voice. All right, so why don't we start off by you telling me who you are, where you work, and what you do there?
Absolutely. So my name is Chelsea Wellmer. I am the Assistant Manager for Market Transformation in North America with the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. So
that is
quite
so
a long
many
name.
Words. What is
a
happening?
lot of words. Right. So we can abbreviate at least the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil to RSPO. That's what we're also known as. And I'm based in Denver, Colorado, but the organization that I work for really is based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And the work we're doing is all over the world. So I'm part of a much larger organization.
Very cool. And I'm assuming that the RSPO cares about SPO, Sustainable Palm Oil. So let's just dive right into that. We'll get to you, I promise. Mm-hmm. But let's talk about palm oil and sustainable palm oil and why this all matters.
Absolutely. So the RSPO was founded in the early 2000s, and the founding members were a group of people, or organizations, I should say, included the WWF, so World Wildlife Fund, that iconic panda logo, and also other actors in the supply chain working with palm oil. And really, it was born out of this need that was seen of taking an industry that for a long time was not sustainable and was causing deforestation, which harms wildlife, it harms the people who live locally, and then trying to switch it and move it to be more sustainable and making sustainable palm oil the norm. So that's how it kind of started in the early 2000s. And at this point, the RSPO, 15 plus years later, has a membership base that includes everyone along the supply chain, all of the actors. So the growers, the mills, the companies that make the products that you buy, environmental NGOs, social NGOs, banks and investors. And they're all really there for the same reason, to make sustainable palm oil the norm.
Cool. I think, I feel like everybody thinks they know what the word sustainable means, but nobody actually talks about it any. It's just like a buzzword nowadays, mm-hmm. But it is actually more than a buzzword. It matters. So can you give a basic definition of what sustainability is?
So for the RSPO, when we're talking about sustainable palm oil, we're talking about certified sustainable palm oil because the RSPO does have a certification standard. So that includes environmental regulations, regulations that involve people that work in the industry or who are in the areas where this industry is operating. There's over 150 standards that we're talking about that the growers have to follow. Everything from no deforestation of high conservation value land, high carbon stock land, primary forest, protection of the animals that are living within these areas or even just passing through these areas. No planting on peat, regardless of depth, which is a big climate change issue because peat is a huge carbon sink. No using fire to prepare land. Limited use of pesticides, and you have to get authorization to actually use pesticides because it's a pretty serious thing. And then all the way up to some of the social standards. So looking at what are the current fair labor standards that are being set by the ILO, and things like no slave labor, no child labor, equal rights for women in the industry who, even if they're pregnant, things that we might take for granted in the US or in other places, but aren't necessarily the standards where we're actually growing palm oil. So really important, and also really important that we're looking at both the environmental side and also the social side because people in the environment are connected.
Absolutely. Makes sense to me. I have a question for you. Who the heck is Pete and why does he have a big sink or whatever you say? No, seriously though, what is Pete and can you explain what that problem is to my listeners?
Yeah, so peat's this like spongy, mossy layer on the ground. Basically, it's what we call a carbon sink, so it's holding a lot of CO2. And when peat is destroyed, usually by burning to create agricultural land, it's releasing all of that CO2 that it's storing into the atmosphere, which is contributing to climate change around the world. So really important to protect it. The RSPO standard is no planting on peat, regardless of depth. It doesn't matter if it's just a few centimeters all the way, to a building size. You can't plant on peat.
Okay, cool. Poor Pete. No, that makes sense. And All right. So what I want to do as we get into things here is I can tell you are very well versed in palm oil and all of the things, which makes sense given your title and job.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think everyone is. I think that the average person, even the average like conservation minded person, every Halloween gets a little digital card that says, buy these candies because they use sustainable palm oil, and don't use these evil candies because they don't, use sustainable palm oil. And that way you won't kill orangutans for your Halloween. And they go, cool, I will do that. And then November hits and it kind of fades in a lot of minds. So can you explain at the most basic level, like, first of all, what is palm oil and what is it doing in our chocolate and what else is it in and all that kind of stuff? And then how is it farmed traditionally so that we know like what the difference is between sustainable and non-sustainable, like real basic palm oil 101.
Oh, you're asking for a very complicated topic in a nutshell, which is actually, which is great. So in my background is in the zoo world, right? And this is what great zoos and organizations that are involved in the environmental side of things are doing, is trying to teach the public about palm oil. And what we like to say is that palm oil, basically, it's an edible vegetable oil. And I'm saying edible, but it's also not just used in edible applications. It's used everywhere, but it's an edible vegetable oil that comes from a very specific palm tree. So not like the palm trees that you might see in Florida or California. It's this palm tree that's actually originally from West Africa. And what happened was that through colonization, the British took it to Southeast Asia, where it can grow really well. Basically, it can grow really well all along the equator. So these really tropical, high biodiversity areas. And they set it up plantation style. The reason they did this is because this tree produces fruit bunches every 2 weeks. So you can actually harvest the fruit every 2 weeks, which is incredible. Most of the other oils that we have, I mean, maybe twice a year, but oftentimes it's just harvesting once a year. So this is kind of like what we've seen as a magical ingredient that requires far less land, far less resources for such a higher yield product. So that's kind of why it's spread so much. And now it's just been used in so many different applications. The common one being chocolate, right? That's always the flagship of palm oil. But it's also used in a lot of different processed foods. It's used in cosmetics, the soaps and shampoos that we use on our bodies. It's also used in manufacturing processes. So like a really weird one that not a lot of people realize. When you take recycled paper, for example, and try to turn it into something else like toilet paper, they actually use palm oil derivatives because they're what we call surfactants. So they're like a scrubber, so they can remove like all of the ink and the impurities in the paper to get that nice, clean, recycled paper content that then becomes toilet paper. It's also in cushions, like foam cushions, because it's used as a bioplastic. So pretty much throughout the day, at some point, and actually usually at multiple points, you are either consuming or touching or using a product that has palm oil in it or in relation to it in some way.
Wow, that's fascinating. I love that you used the term magic because, like, even though it is causing problems, it's important to realize that, like, one thing that grows that quickly and does that much is actually kind of awesome. Like, that it exists. We just need to handle it properly.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of why we talk about sustainable palm oil versus unsustainable palm oil. So if you grow it right in a sustainable way, it's amazing. But like any agricultural product, you can grow it in a non-sustainable way. That's true pretty much with everything. And so for a long time, that's historically how it was grown because the environment wasn't as much of a concern at the time. But as consumers, especially in North America and Western Europe, have kind of started to prioritize sustainability in the environment and the products that they're buying, it's become more of an important issue. So that's why we're seeing this push for sustainable palm oil.
That makes sense. And, the term sustainable, going back to that for a second, it doesn't mean that you can just, I don't know. I feel like sometimes I talk to people about that term and they think it means like that you can sustain keeping, in this case, keeping the palm oil going. But that's not really what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about sustaining everything around it, right? And keeping stuff going.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of both. So when we're looking at sustainable palm oil, it is definitely about trying to maintain the important forest areas around these concessions that are being used for the production of palm oil. But it's also about looking at the crop itself and how can we get the highest yield out of the crop. So also about kind of making the crop itself more sustainable in the long run. So how can we get the highest yield? How can we take care of it so it lasts longer? One of my like the really cool facts I've learned about these oil palm trees that just kind of blows my mind is that they generally are in production for 20 plus years. They're producing for that long. The only reason they get retired is because they usually get so physically tall that it's incredibly difficult for the workers to be able to harvest the fruit bunches from the trees because it's all still done by hand. So they're literally just too tall to actually get the fruit off of. So that's when you can retire an oil palm plantation. So yeah, sustainability all around, basically, if we do it right.
Cool, makes sense. And so how without going through all 150 points, how do we become a sustainable producer of palm oil? Like what is the difference?
So if you're following the RSPO's principles and criteria, so the rules that they've set out for the growers, really it's looking at people, prosperity, and planet. So since we're on your podcast, right, we're looking at animals here. Let's talk about the planet piece for a second. What that largely means is you can only be planting on degraded land, so land that's not a primary forest, that's not a forest that has high biodiversity, high conservation value. One of the really interesting things that I think that we take for granted here is that when we go to agricultural areas like in North America, for example, we're not thinking about these really amazing wild species that might walk through our agriculture areas, right? But that's something that people have to deal with in places like Southeast Asia, in places like the Amazon, in Western Africa. So protection of an Asian elephant that might just start walking through your land, which I would think be the coolest thing to see. Yes. Protection of those species, yeah, right? Protection of those species and also protection of the workers who are working on those concessions. And then also protection of the waterways that are next to these concessions, so the riparian zones, protection of the peat that we talked about, so those spongy, mossy layers that hold so much carbon stock, not using fire to prepare land. That was often kind of a traditional way to prepare land for planting, was just let's burn it down. But that causes an environmental problem, obviously, but also a social problem as well when we talk about like air pollution, right? So that can affect the people that live in the area of Southeast Asia when they're burning so much. So not using fire at all, big rule. The really cool thing is that a lot of these principles and criteria were updated or strengthened in 2018. That's the last time the RSPO ratified the principles and criteria. And they ratify it every 5 years. So we're actually getting ready to ratify again in 2023. And so right now we're looking at what are our standards, how can we improve them, what needs to be updated, and trying to introduce it to all of the members of the RSPO, even introduce it to the public. The process is very transparent to get the public involved, and we can all look at that and update it as we see accordingly for the next 5 years.
Very cool. Okay, so I think we have a pretty decent handle now on, why this matters and what palm oil is and sustainability and all that jazz. But what is the RSPO? Like in terms of, I don't know. It's just a very interesting name, and like who makes y'all official, and like you're using these big words like ratify and certify and all that stuff. Can you explain like what this organization is?
Yeah, so the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, the RSPO, was founded back in the early 2000s, like 2004-ish, and it is comprised of all of the stakeholders in the palm oil industry. So that's the growers, the investors, the mills, the manufacturers, the consumer good manufacturers, the retailers that sell the product, the environmental NGOs, the social NGOs. And the RSPO is it is a nonprofit. I don't think a lot of people realize that, but it's a working nonprofit with the goal to make sustainable palm oil the norm. So it's kind of a holistic approach to sustainability. When we talk about like the principles and criteria and ratifying them, for example, we're talking about a membership base that is saying, okay, here's what we want to see moving forward, and let's vote on whether or not we agree. Okay, for example. So I think it's really astounding that we can get so many different stakeholders for so many different areas of one industry to kind of have this conversation, all be sitting at the table. Hint, hint, that's why it's called Roundtable.
I like it.
Right.
Do you actually have a round table anywhere in your building? I'm just asking.
Well, I work from home, so I should get one, right, to have my meetings. But it's really cool to bring all of these different voices together to push the industry to be more sustainable, and drive that change. So that's a little bit about us. We have a lot of environmental members. That's actually how I got involved with the RSPO. So really big push from the zoo and aquarium community. They make up kind of the bulk of the environmental organizations that are within the RSPO and are pushing for that change, which I think is really cool. WWF is a big one. They were actually one of the founding members of the RSPO.
Very cool. And that is rare. Just, for those listening, to have all of the different stakeholders at there we go again, at the table, is genuinely shocking. I feel like most of the conservation discussions that I have are built around the idea of trying to get all the different stakeholders with their various values and competing, desires and such to the table. Now I can't use any other analogy now that you said that. But involved. And then but like people don't want to, and so it becomes almost competitive with like, all right, well, we've got to, we're working together to stop these evil corporations, whereas you're saying, hey, y'all aren't evil, let's find a way to make this work, right? And that's very cool.
Yeah, exactly. And I think especially in the last couple of years, we've really seen that a lot of our supply chains, especially international supply chains, can be so delicate and can be disrupted so easily. But also there are so many markets and places that people can sell out there. So like, let's say tomorrow, for example, like this is definitely not going to happen, but let's say tomorrow, suddenly North American buyers are like, we're not going to buy palm oil anymore. There are dozens of other countries, dozens of areas around the world that are still buying this product. So if we're not working with the people in this industry, they can just go work with somebody else. And maybe those other people don't currently support sustainability at the same level. So I think, this concept of boycotting or trying to not work with everybody who's a stakeholder is an incredibly difficult and unproductive thing to do.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. That's really interesting to me. All right. So I guess what I'm wondering is, as far as like, I'm sure that it would be boring to ask for an organizational history, but how did this organization come together with all these different groups? Like, I can't picture that happening. That doesn't happen a lot in conservation. Do you know how that happened and why?
Yeah, so really what happened was there's like this pressing global call for sustainability within the industry that arose in the early 2000s. So it was in 2004, WWF, so environmental nonprofit, Unilever, right, a consumer goods manufacturer, and some other actors within the industry like growers, they got together and they had a discussion of, what do we need to do? And that's how the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil was formed, was these different actors along the supply chain meeting and deciding we need to work on this together. And since then, it's snowballed. We're at over 5,000 members across the different stakeholder groups. And all of them can participate in the RSPO and really contribute to its forward movement.
That's really amazing and really unique in the conservation world, I think. Sometimes I feel like, I see multiple organizations working on the same thing and I'm like, can't y'all just be friends? Like, can't those resources, I mean, I get it. But yeah, it's an interesting thing. And it's so cool to see y'all coming together. I almost said to the table again, but my listeners will beat me if I keep that going. But yeah, no, it's really cool to see all of that just kind of coming together in such a cool way here. And we're talking, like we said, I know this is important for everything, but we talk about land and we talk about people, but of course it's an animal podcast. And I think everyone knows that orangutans are the poster animal for palm oil, but is it just orangutans that we're saving? And why is it orangutans that care so much about palm oil and all of that?
Orangutans are definitely like the flagship species of palm oil conservation when we talk about sustainable palm oil. I think that's because they're just such a charismatic animal. They're so like us. They're so relatable. really, really cool. But it's honestly affecting pretty much any species that you can find in a tropical area where oil palms are being grown for this production. So when we're talking about Southeast Asia, for example, other charismatic species that are being impacted are Asian elephants. You have like Malayan tigers, Sumatran rhinos. Kind of they're being impacted though. Their conservation issues a little bit more because they're just so spread out because there's so few of them now. But historically, that would be an environmental concern for them. And then you look all the way towards like West and Central Africa. So you have animals like chimpanzees, Western lowland gorillas, okapi, the African forest elephant. And then you go a little bit further west, all the way to South America, Central America, and you're looking at sloths, jaguars, anteaters, tapirs. So really cool species across the board that are being impacted, and why palm oil has such a huge kind of awareness around it in terms of the conservation and the sustainability impact.
Cool. That makes a lot of sense. And normally this is how I start my episodes, but I was too curious about the organization. But now I want to learn a little bit about Chelsea. So tell me some stuff about you. How did you get into this world? How did you get to the RSPO? All that good stuff.
I don't know if this is the common answer you hear when we're talking about like the zoo world and conservation. I'm not going to feel bad about it. I used to, right? But I fell into it, which I think is different. Like I had no idea when I was growing up that working in a zoo or working in conservation was a viable career path. So when I went to school, nothing to do with conservation and sustainability. It's all been learned through actual like real life experience at this point.
Me too. So I'm here for that. Like that's really cool. Right. What did you study? I'm curious.
Yeah, I have a BA. That's it right now. And I triple majored in archaeology, art history, and classics.
Holy crap, you're a bigger nerd than me. That's impressive. Nice.
Right. I think I did like a 180 switch. Like I was digging in the ground for people's trash, right? And now I'm working to prevent people from putting trash in the ground. So working on sustainability. And so what ended up happening was after college, I decided to go into the Peace Corps. And I got accepted. And in between my graduation and actually going into my Peace Corps service, I needed just like a really short part-time job. And I got one that was really about environmental education, working with some animals that they had. It was an outdoor education camp. And because of that experience, when I came back from the Peace Corps, again, looking for a job, I actually landed at the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Garden. So that's kind of my start in the zoological community.
Okay, well, let's pause there because I have a big love of Cincy and have had many current and former Cincy people on. They are a huge help to the podcast. So tell me about your time at Cincy. What did you do there, and did you get to know anybody awesome there or anything like that?
Got to know a lot of awesome people, several of whom I believe have been on your podcast.
I think so, yeah.
Shout out to the recent addition of Colleen and Mark, who I know you talked to fairly recently. But when I was at Cincinnati Zoo, I got to do what I love most, and that's talking to people about conservation. So I was hired as part of their Wild Encounters team. So I was like a Wild Encounters interpreter. Really, that meant getting to work with the ambassador animals. So bringing them out into the public, talking to the guests about these animals and how cool they were, making them fall in love with the animals, and then talking about how the guests could, do little behaviors to help that animal conservation-wise. Let's talk about the broader conservation issues surrounding this animal. So that's how I started at Cincinnati Zoo. I was also part of their inaugural AmeriCorps group that they started there, and that role was as the visitor engagement member. So really got to play around with how are we actually telling our conservation stories and kind of changing up that messaging and seeing if it was better, if it was worse than what we were doing, but how can we change conservation storytelling to have a better impact?
That's really cool. And that's actually something I'm really interested in. So I'm doing Project Dragonfly right now, working towards my master's. And I just finished my first semester. Literally, I submitted my last assignment like yesterday.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And I'm still trying to figure out exactly what the heck I'm doing with it, honestly. But a big thing for me is obviously conservation messaging. And so I'm trying to look into like signage and other things that we use there and how effective. My first actual study that I did for Project Dragonfly was about the effects of different types of signage at an exhibit at the Cleveland Zoo. And I'm so interested in that kind of messaging thing. That's really cool that y'all were working on that. And I think that's really powerful. And I guess it probably had some good effects because Cincinnati is one of the best when it comes to that.
Yeah, since Cincinnati's doing a great job. Definitely loved my time there. Luckily, I get to visit a lot because my husband's family is from Cincinnati. So whenever we go back, I'm like, we're going to the zoo at least once, right?
That's
so
awesome.
I'm always dragging them there.
I'm curious, did you overlap with Katie Prop when she was in that area at all, or did you meet her in the Denver world?
It's really funny. We actually met in the AZA world recently at the conference in Baltimore.
Oh, wait. You guys just, okay, so hold on, because that's hilarious. Okay, so for my listeners and for everyone else, Chelsea and I connected almost at the AZA conference, except we basically missed each other. But the whole reason why was that Katie Prop was singing your praises. And I just assumed that y'all were like long-term friends, but you guys just met at the conference?
We just met at the conference, did not know of each other. I think we probably knew a little bit of each other's work, but not the people behind it. And then funnily found out that we've been kind of like orbiting each other for years now. So I believe she was there while I was at Cincinnati, but Cincinnati is kind of a larger zoo and has so many employees that I'm sure I sat in a meeting with her at some point, like an all-staff meeting, but I did not know her personally. And then turns out we both moved to Colorado, still doing conservation work.
I was going to say, that's amazing. I just assumed that y'all knew each other, especially, like you said, Cincy, Denver, you're all in. Yeah, you guys should be best friends because that would be adorable. You can just go and hang out at bars and talk about saving animals and it'll be lovely. So I highly recommend it.
Yeah, we'll meet up and send you a picture.
Perfect. I love it. That would legitimately make me so happy. But that's so funny. This is what I love about the conservation world, though. Like, we were all at that conference and like making these great connections, and now here we are, sharing your message and stuff. And like, y'all didn't even know each other. That's amazing. Yeah, that's very cool. Like, Katie literally just ran up to me one night, I think it was at dinner, and was like, John, there's a person here that I have to introduce you to because your podcast is going to be awesome. And I was like, okay. And of course she did it, just like that with the usual amount of Katie Prop speed and intensity. And she's like, no, she's here and she's really cool and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, okay. Oh, okay, cool. And I did not realize y'all had just met. That's adorable, frankly.
Right. But I agree with you. Like, that's what I love about the conservation community is everyone is so supportive of the work we're doing. I'm sure you've talked about this so much on your podcast, but like so many people don't realize that zoos are these huge conservation organizations that are really pushing the industry to do better. I mean, zoos have such a huge platform to reach the public, right? Again, I'm sure you said it a million times. But that's what I think is so cool about it. And yeah.
No, definitely. And that's actually one thing that I try to push, when I talk to people, especially like PR people and stuff like that, because I book my interviews through PR people normally, I do push them, as much as I can without, losing my podcast connection, but to be like, hey, I love your Instagram feed. You do a great job curating it. What if maybe just like once a week talked about the amazing conservation work you do instead of showing another cute animal and saying why it's cute? Like, that's important too. It really is. But I'm amazed at the amount of zoos that I get to. And when I'm there, I'm learning about their conservation efforts for the first time, like as I'm doing an interview, when I'm somebody who actively seeks this out and looks for it, and I can't even find that stuff sometimes, The work is incredible. The communication of it needs to step up at a lot of zoos, though.
Yeah. And so that's actually kind of a really good segue into why I ended up in the palm oil world. So from Cincinnati Zoo, I went to the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo in Colorado Springs. I don't know if you've ever been, also a really great zoo, highly recommend, super unique, on the side of a mountain. And what I really loved about the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo while I was there was that they, again, heavily involved in conservation initiatives. And they kind of took it a step further, in my opinion. And they said, well, we can talk about conservation, but how can we actually make this like a feasible action for the public? And so the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo has different legacy projects, so conservation initiatives that they're very heavily involved in. And one of them is orangutans and palm oil. And so that's kind of how they stepped up. They were the first zoo to ever join the RSPO, actually, and they're kind of spearheading the movement within North America. But then they created their infamous palm oil app that I moved to Colorado Springs to work on that program and to run that app.
Oh, wow. That's really cool. Okay. Yeah. So I knew about the app. I have not made it to Cheyenne Mountain Zoo, and I
Mhm.
have driven past the zoo when it was closed, and I was on a on a gig on tour, and I couldn't stop, and it like hurt my heart because it is that and Point Defiance are the two in the country that I most want to get to that I haven't been to yet. And so yeah, that does make me sad, but I'm excited to have you on. And I know that like you even went ahead and like spoke to the zoo to let them know you're going to be on and stuff and talking about things a little bit, right? Am I remembering that correctly? Yeah.
Yes.
And I think that's really cool. And also, I'm really excited to have somebody, from Cheyenne Mountain Zoo on the podcast, even if you're not there anymore. But like, you're here, you were there, they let you. This is cool. I'm excited. I feel like I'm cheating to get Cheyenne Mountain Zoo on. But tell me a little bit about your time at Cheyenne Mountain Zoo and what you were doing there and what animals you worked with and all that stuff.
Yeah, so kind of the transition from Cincinnati Zoo to Cheyenne Mountain Zoo, I definitely had to give up working more directly with animals. That wasn't going to be my role at Cheyenne Mountain Zoo anymore. But really, it was having a bigger impact in conservation work and important conservation work. So a little bit of backstory. So what happened with the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo is that one of the orangutan caretakers, Dina, she went to our CEO, Bob Chastain, and told him about how she had heard of palm oil and how palm oil was the big bad, the big scary. And at the time, they were saying that worst case scenario, orangutans could be extinct within like 10 years, right? And so, as a zoological organization that was caring for orangutans, they felt it was our duty to start talking about palm oil and the conservation work needed around it. And so, what's really cool is the CEO at the time, and even now still, he said, if we're going to do this, let's do it right and let's go all in. And this started as a conservation initiative at the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo with just multiple staff members volunteering their time outside of the regular jobs to kind of push palm oil forward. And at the very beginning, they actually were saying to boycott palm oil. Fun fact. That was a long, long time ago, like over 10 years ago. And what happened is that they went on what they call like a
You can tell you're interviewing a younger person
well,
when you're like, a long time ago, 10 years ago. Like, no, it wasn't that long ago, but okay.
I'll say it was a long time ago. It was before my time at the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo. They went on what they call like a fact-finding mission. They went to Indonesia, Malaysia, and had, dozens of meetings with growers and actually like local chieftains who lived around these plantations. They met with the RSPO, they met with government officials to kind of talk about palm oil, learn like what's actually happening on the ground and what they were saying. These experts in situ, what were they saying we need to do to reverse the damage and to be more sustainable, and what's the solution. And so from that trip and that experience, that's when they first learned about the RSPO and said, hey, this is an organization we really need to support and we're going to join. So they were kind of the catalyst in the zoos that actually ended up joining the RSPO. And then for the crown jewel of the program, the app that was created, that really started as they wanted consumers to be able to understand which companies to support when shopping, and it started as just like a little printout guide that you could cut out and stick in your wallet. And it's grown so much to so many companies that, if we were to try to print it out, it would cover your house, right? Like it would be just way too many, which is really great, but not feasible for a printout anymore. So an app was created to allow consumers to scan the barcodes of products, and then the app will tell them how that company's doing in terms of sourcing sustainable palm oil.
Which is really, really awesome. And I'm a big fan of that. I know I've promoted the app a bunch of times on here, but for people who haven't heard that yet, how can you go about getting the app?
Yeah, so if someone's had the app for a long time, it actually just relaunched in the last year. So the new way to find the app, if it didn't automatically update on your phone, or if you haven't looked at it recently, is to just go into the Apple App Store or Google Play, and you can type in palm oil scan, and you'll see a logo that's a green orangutan, and you can download that app onto your phone. And what's really cool about this relaunch of the app is that the old app that Cheyenne Mountain Zoo created was really only available for customers in the US and Canada. But now the app is available. It's in the US, it's in Canada, it's launched in the UK, it's preparing to launch in New Zealand, Australia. And that was because there is so much demand from people worldwide who are contacting the zoo being like, we really want this app in our areas. When are you going to bring it here? And so Cheyenne Mountain Zoo partnered with WAZA, so the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums, and then other stakeholders like Chester Zoo and Auckland Zoo, all are working together to bring this app to be more global.
That is so cool. And I didn't know that it had relaunched. I'm actually, as we're speaking, I just downloaded the new because it's important to have that on your phone. So that's really good to know. That's very cool. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. That's really exciting. And I guess I was just wondering if you could name every company that is doing good sustainable palm. No, I'm kidding. But
well, no, it's really funny about that though, because what's really common is like people will download the app and they'll use it, for 1 or 2 grocery shopping trips. And they're like, okay, like I know which products that I want to buy are sustainable and which aren't. And then they'll often delete the app or kind of stop using it. And what I like to tell people is that app is being updated constantly. And those ratings for those companies their companies are getting audited once a year. And so those ratings have the potential to change once a year, if not more, depending on the circumstances. So really, I think it's important to kind of use it constantly because there are folks at the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo, there are folks at Chester Zoo, Auckland Zoo, who are working to make sure that these are the most up-to-date ratings you can find, the most up-to-date information to support the companies.
That is good to know. I am definitely guilty of the check once and be like, okay, cool. Now I can buy this stuff thing.
Right.
So good to know. Good to know. guilty. But, hey, that's good to know. Man, I love this. I love the merge of technology and conservation education. Obviously, says the podcaster. But I really do think it's like really important and so much easier to I'm just a big believer that, I read these papers about what we need to do to save the planet and what we can do to save the planet for Project Dragonfly all the time. And some of them are just so realistic and like, look, people are going to people and we need to meet them in the middle. Mm-hmm. And some are like, cool, all we need to do is end globalization, get every single local community back to producing everything that they need and we'll be fine. And I'm like, no, that's just, it's not going to happen. I mean, sadly, but it's not going to happen. And, so yeah, I think it's really cool when we meet people where they are. Hey, not everybody, but a lot of people have smartphones now. And here's an opportunity to just waste a little battery and, help save the planet. That's pretty solid. I dig that. So how did you go from the zoo to the RSPO? And do you miss having even though you weren't working as regularly with animals at Cheyenne Mountain, do you miss having, a zoo as your workplace?
100%. So I do miss having a zoo as my workplace, but I love the work that I'm doing with the RSPO. So what happened was because of my job at the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo, working so heavily on palm oil and promoting sustainable palm oil and working with the RSPO themselves, there was an opportunity at the RSPO that came up that it made sense as the next step in my career to kind of increase the impact. So now with my new job, I'm working a lot more closely with the companies in North America who are members of the RSPO and even the companies who want to be and want to care about their sustainable palm oil sourcing to make sure that, they're doing it right. And kind of having this ripple effect, because then when we get companies in North America to support sustainable palm oil, they're supporting the growers on the ground in the countries that are actually growing the oil palm trees and producing palm oil. So really cool global effect my new job has. But the downside is, yes, I don't get to walk outside my office and get to see an orangutan or a lion or, a really cool Brazilian rainbow boa that somebody has out and is teaching the public about.
Yeah, that's what makes me sad about my job too. So I can relate to that. That's cool though. That so you're so conservation focused that it wasn't about zookeeping for you. It wasn't about taking care of the animals for you, although of course it was wildly important while you were doing it. But it really all comes down to conservation work and saving animals in the wild, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I love the animals, but I saw that I could have a bigger impact in talking to people instead of directly working with the animals, maybe not having as much face-to-face with people, even though I'll say at this point, it seems like anybody who is an animal caretaker or a zookeeper in a zoological setting, really they have to be able to talk to people about conservation. That's kind of a requirement of the job now because it's so important. But I saw that I could have a big impact this way and still be in conservation.
Yeah, that's really awesome. I love that. What, when you were working with animals, what were some of your favorites though?
Oh, you can't pick favorites.
No. Okay. So this is how we know that I know that you haven't listened to a lot of Rossifari yet, but in 200 plus episodes, almost everyone tries to tell me they don't have a favorite. Mm-hmm. And then tells me their favorites. So we just have a rule on this podcast that if you say you don't have favorites, you're lying. And remember, the animals aren't listening.
Oh gosh, now I have like, and I can't bring it down to just one. Um, no, but you know what's funny? I'll admit this on a podcast. Before I started my role at the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo, that obviously we talked earlier about how orangutans are kind of the flagship species for palm whale. Before I started working at the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo and got to know the orangutans really closely because I was working with their care team on conservation issues, I was not a primate person. Like, I think they're great, like nothing against them. It was just, I was kind of lukewarm about it. I was like, yeah, they're cool, but like I loved other species and my eyes would light up when I saw those other ones and not necessarily primates. Now I'm like, I was wrong. Like I was so wrong. And so at the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo, there is a female Bornean orangutan. Her name is Hadia, and she is so charismatic. And I think anyone from Cheyenne Mountain Zoo who has visited Cheyenne Mountain Zoo wouldn't be surprised to hear me say that she is one of my favorites because she is pretty much everybody's favorite. But yeah, I'll have to go visit her soon because I'm sure she's like, where is Chelsea? Why hasn't she come to visit me soon? That's one of the things I love about them is because they're so smart.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've had that. So I was not into great apes very much at all either until I did an episode where Tiffany James at Zoo Knoxville was like, I'm going to make you fall in love with my great apes. And she took me and, let me meet them. I mean, obviously, like not meet because you can't do that with gorillas. But,
protected barrier.
Yeah. And like I, got to know their personalities and hang out with them and see her relationship with them. And yeah, I walked away in love with them. And like elephants were another animal species that I just like, they're cool. They're big. They're kind of like rocks that sway. And, then I recently did that thing where I was drumming with Emily and, damn if I don't just love elephants now and just like stare at them with like my heart, like, I don't know. It's like that thing in The Grinch where your heart grows like 3 times, and that's happened to me with like every species I've met now, to the point where when people are like, are there any animals you don't like? I'm like, no, I even used to be an arachnophobe and now love spiders and have handled tarantulas and stuff because how can you not love them? They're amazing. Everything is amazing except for humans. Humans are still the worst.
Yeah, well, and it's really funny. Like I think we see a lot of zoo people, they'll start naming like individual animals often, right? Like as their favorites because they kind of know the quirks of those individual animals a little bit more. But then in terms of like a species at this point, I would say my favorite animal is a beaver.
Beavers are so cool. I love
and a lot
that.
of people look at me weird when I say that. And I'm like, no, it's because of the conservation work that beavers do. They're little conservationists. It certainly helps that they're cute and fluffy, right? But they're little conservationists. And as someone who's living in Colorado, I think I can really appreciate the work that beavers do. If you just let them do beaver things, they're helping with water retention. They're helping prevent forest fires. And I think that's so incredible.
Oh my gosh, it so is. Also, it just comes down to they really do have personalities. I think so many people think that like certain animals don't have personalities. I remember I was at the Columbus Zoo one time and trying to get a good picture of one of the beavers there. And the beaver in question seemed to get annoyed at me. And I wasn't using flash or anything, like just normal stuff. But like, I don't know, maybe I was disturbing it or something. I don't know. And I tried to take a picture and the glass was kind of muddy. So I tried to take another picture and the glass was kind of muddy. And I went to take a third one and it just spun around and slapped its tail down and splashed water all over me. And I was like, oh, all right, I'm out. And I hear you. You don't want to be photographed. It's fine.
Yep,
but
that's a no.
It was very intentional. Yeah. And it then turned and just stared me down. I was like, okay, I'm leaving. You're good. You're good. But yeah, so many beavers are awesome. That's hilarious. So, to take it back to palm oil for a second, I recently had a guest on who basically gave the opinion that, first of all, there is no such thing as sustainable palm oil. And second of all, that if we eliminate the use of palm oil entirely, or if we, at least the unsustainable kind, then the land will be destroyed with other things that are easy and quick to grow, like the plants that make paper and stuff like that. I'm curious what your take on that is.
Yeah, so really interesting question. I would say there are some things in there that I agree with and some things that I disagree with. Because palm oil is such a complex issue, so that's actually pretty normal, and why it's really difficult to talk about sometimes with the public when the media makes it seem like it's a really simple issue when it's not. So I would disagree when someone says that there's no such thing as sustainable palm oil. I think we need to recognize that when we're talking about sustainable palm oil, it certainly has been a journey. And I feel like the word journey is used so much in conservation, but that's because it really is. You know, the RSPO was started in 2004. These standards have continuously improved over the years and are going to keep improving. And right now, when we're talking about sustainable palm oil, the RSPO is only certifying roughly 20% of the global supply chain. So we're not saying all palm oil and nearly not even half of palm oil. It's really only 20%, which I think kind of surprises some people. So it's a pretty high standard to achieve. So kudos to the growers, whether they're big companies or whether they're smallholders like family farms who are working to make their production more sustainable. And we can talk a little bit more about that if you'd like. In terms of his comment about if we were to suddenly stop supporting palm oil or suddenly everyone just stopped growing oil palm trees and stopped producing it, like they're going to move on to something else. I absolutely agree, 100%. Again, people are going to people. We're talking about livelihoods here, right? So part of what the RSPO is looking at is making sure that the people who are in the industry and are producing palm oil are being supported and can make enough money to feed their family, to send their kids to school, to live life at a level that is normal, right? And not be stricken by poverty, because a lot of the areas where they do produce palm oil are areas that are susceptible to poverty, unfortunately. So if somebody who is a farmer gets told that they can't grow oil palm trees anymore, they're not just going to stop working and just be like, I give up. They're going to move on to something else. And if they're in the agricultural field, that could be rubber trees, that could be timber. There's a number of different products that they could start growing instead of palm oil that would cause deforestation.
Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. But if we stick with sustainable growth in that place, then those people can't come in and grow those things, right?
Yeah, so kind of the concept is, and what's also really interesting is that when we talk about palm oil production, a little over 40% of the people who are growing palm oil or producing palm oil, like growing the oil palm trees, they are smallholder farmers. So they're family farms that have less than 50 hectares of land. So they're not like the big bad industry that I think some people picture in their mind, even though a lot of those, quote unquote, big bad industry are actually doing great things now. They're family farms and they need to be able to make a livelihood to support those families. And so, yeah, that's what I think is so cool about the RSPO is looking specifically at the standards and how can we make those standards and how can the RSPO support the smallholders that want to meet those standards. Because like we said at the beginning, conservation is a people issue, right? Conservation issues are caused by people, but that means that people are going to be the solution. And so getting them actually directly involved in sustainability is, I think, way better than just kind of cutting them off.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes sense to me. All right. So, you've mentioned that the RSPO is a certification organization, amongst other things. Y'all like certify, places. So first of all, what happens if people or places or whatever organizations, you tell me, you're the one who knows, don't end up holding up those standards? And also, do you have any way to know that they're working?
Yes. So obviously the standards have been set pretty high. And what happens if a grower, for example, isn't following the standards, like if they break one of the principles and criteria, quote unquote, break a rule, there is kind of a procedure in place. So the RSPO will work with those organizations to try to get them back on track. And depending on the severity of what happened, there's also a remediation and compensation procedure. What that means is that it could be anything from needing to reforest an area to having to pay a certain amount of money, maybe to parties that were affected by whatever happened. So there is a procedure in place for if a grower does not follow the principles and criteria. And I think it's really important to note too that the RSPO is a voluntary standard, is a voluntary organization. So these companies that do join the RSPO, they're voluntarily doing it. No one's making them. Right. So we also want to be able to work with them if there is a misstep to kind of get them back on track, because if we decided to kick them out over one infraction in the beginning, then they're no longer going to be part of the organization and they can just do whatever they want, up to deforestation. So I think it's really important, again, that whole concept of like working together with all of the stakeholders across the supply chain. And what we've seen from this practice, which is really cool, is that there was actually an independent study that was conducted. It was a life cycle assessment, and they found that RSPO certified palm oil has a 20% lower biodiversity impact. So it is having an impact. So it is helping protect the species that live in and around these areas.
That's awesome. I love that. Also, you may notice that I'm dancing around a lot. So I'm in this weird housing right now because I'm doing a gig, and they have no tables or chairs in this entire place that they got us to live. So I'm sitting on the floor with my mic on the bed, trying to like somehow not cramp up everywhere when I'm talking to you. So like, I promise you, I'm not bored or I don't have ADHD, nothing like that. I'm just literally trying to like, right now, as I'm sitting up close to the mic, I am sitting with my legs crossed and leaning over. And I'm just trying to not do that for the whole hour plus of our conversation. So just if you see the weirdness, because I know I was like in the corner of the screen for a second there and I was like, this gotta look weird.
You know what? I think that's going to be a like human experience across the board, especially as we've gone really virtual. I think everyone's been in a weird position. Yeah, we've done virtual interviews and calls, so no worries.
Yeah, I'm like you're giving this very serious answer, and I'm like doing yoga.
You weren't distracting. Don't worry.
Okay, good. That's always the concern. And I'll probably leave this part in the podcast because I always like kind of laughing at myself on the podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So one of the things that I find interesting about the RSPO is that you actually have, like we talked about, all the different stakeholders involved, which is really cool, including the companies who are, voluntarily being a part of this, which is even cooler because it shows that they care. Is it a two-way street, though? Are they just like meeting the standards? Or if they care about the standards, are they also trying to help get out the word about sustainable palm oil and help with conservation efforts?
Absolutely. So what's really cool is that I think a lot of people, when we talk about like what is sustainable, is there's kind of this idyllic version of, again, like that small family farm, very local, which is so incredibly important, in which the RSPO is actively working in and supporting. But realistically, there's also another side to the industry that is these larger corporations who are working on a kind of a larger scale and having more of a global impact. And so when we have these larger members join the RSPO, they can have a really important difference in promoting sustainable palm oil or even protecting biodiversity. So like, for example, we have a member in Northern Amazon, they're called AgroPalma, and they've been given this concession of land to use for production, and they've actually set aside 60% of it to be conserved, which I think is amazing. So they have this, like, not only do they have their oil palm that they're growing and then producing palm oil, they also have this like conservation forest that they've created and that they're kind of overseeing at this point. So these big companies can make a huge difference because they're working at such a high scale. And then when we look at some of like the big consumer goods manufacturers, the big retailers in North America, what I find really fascinating, and I'm gonna pause for a second, because do you know, like, have you ever heard the concept of like when you meet an animal for the first time? Like when I was working with animals, some of them, they would tell me like the age and say, oh yeah, this animal's 5 years old. And then even though I was working there for another 5 years, I'd be like, oh yeah, the animal's only 5 years old. Like the animal never aged.
Oh, totally.
It's like stuck in your brain, right? Yes. So I think what happened was that in the early 2000s, a lot of people got upset with some of the environmental impacts that they thought that these larger companies were having. In response to the public outcry, some of the companies that we saw as like the worst offenders are now some of the ones that are doing the best in terms of going the extra mile in supporting sustainable palm oil. But I think sometimes the public has a hard time forgetting that original, concept that was in their brain and seeing the progress that's been made over the last 15 plus years. So we have companies in North America who are investing in satellite technology to monitor forests in real time and find if, like, for example, there's a fire happening, where is that fire occurring, and can we stop it? We have companies who are sourcing 100% physically certified sustainable palm oil, but then they still are putting extra money to support smallholders, even though they've kind of done their duty in supporting sustainable palm oil. They're like, okay, let's give some extra money to smallholders and let's support them. So we have some really cool work that major corporations are doing across the globe.
That's awesome. I really love hearing that. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I think in general, we have this thing where like if a person or a company or whatever does something wrong and gets called out for it, then they're just evil forever. And that's not really how the world works. And I don't think any of us talking or listening to this podcast would want to be judged by the worst thing that we ever did. And, especially if it was something that was a growth moment for us. So that's very cool. All right. How can people get involved? How can people support the RSPO? Should they download the app? How can people help?
Yeah, I think downloading the Waza palm oil scan app is a very easy action for the average consumer, assuming that you live in like the US, Canada, UK, New Zealand, Australia. That's a great action. I think directly supporting the RSPO, I would say just learn more about it. Head over to rspo.org. That's the website. It was actually just relaunched. There's some really beautiful pictures and videos on there. Like on the homepage, there's this image, or it's actually a video that comes across and it's a tiger and I love it. So go there just to learn about it, because I think there's still this misconception about like what palm oil is, and people still think palm oil is this really bad thing, when hopefully I've made it clear that if we boycott palm oil, like it's not going to support the people who live there and they're going to do something else. But also, like, if we were to boycott palm oil, we're just going to have to switch to a different oil, like rapeseed, canola, maybe soy. And those, in soy specifically, if it's not grown sustainably, that requires even more land, and it's going to be grown in the Amazon. So also big deforestation impact, right? So I would say go to the RSPO's website, learn about what the RSPO is doing, start asking those questions of like, oh, well, if I boycotted palm oil, what would be replaced instead? And what's the environmental impact? Does that kind of go the extra couple of questions after, you might think to boycott palm oil? And hopefully you'll realize that sustainable palm oil is a really great viable solution. The RSPO is doing great work, and tell your friends and family about the work the RSPO is doing. You can also, when you're shopping, look for the RSPO trademark on products if you'd like to buy a product. One of my favorites, and again, I shouldn't have favorites, Girl Scout cookies. So if you look at a box of Girl Scout cookies, you will see the RSPO trademark on that box of Girl Scout cookies to assure you that it has been that cookies been produced using certified sustainable palm oil.
Nice. I love that. And I love Girl Scout cookies. What's your favorite Girl Scout cookie?
Ooh, Samoa's.
Okay.
100%.
I'm Thin Mint all the way. Thin Mints are just
classic.
Heaven. Yeah. Amazing.
Have you, this might be really gross. Have you ever tried, this is what I do, Thin Mints with peanut butter on them?
No, mint and peanut butter together? That
I know it sounds gross. I don't know where I came up with it, but I like to freeze the Thin Mints and then put peanut butter on them. And I think it was because of like the old Parent Trap movie with the Oreos and peanut butter. I think that's where it must have been born from. And now I'm like, yes, I need peanut butter on my Thin Mints.
Okay, I'm gonna have to try that next Girl Scout cookie season. I'll have to try that. I like it. Perfect. Very cool. And then it is time. It's time now, don't you know? We've come to the end of the show, but there's one tale left to go. You're gonna laugh and say, oh no. It's time for the Rossifari poop story.
Oh, poop stories.
Poop story.
There's so many poop stories.
Poop story.
I would say there's a story that's really horrifying for me, and there's a story that's really horrifying for the poor 5-year-olds that were around me. So I'm going to give you two. So one of the grossest poop-related things that I ever had to deal with, and it happened a couple of times, is at the Cincinnati Zoo. They have ambassador flamingos. And so part of my job when it was like the nice sunny season was we would walk the flamingos around the zoo. And then usually we would walk them over to this habitat space where there was another population of flamingos that weren't ambassador flamingos. They were just standard flamingos hanging out that people could go look at. And so we would like let them in. They would hang out all day. And then at the end of the day, we would have to go collect the ambassador flamingos from the flock and walk them back to where they lived at night. Right. And so some of these flamingos would just happily walk out, be like, yep, it's bedtime. I'm ready to go in. Great. And some of them were like, no. So we had to put on these like big wader boots and kind of start walking out there. And it was a flamingo habitat. So it had water in it. It had some little land islands. And depending on what part of the area the flamingo was in, like we would have to like jump out onto these little land islands to kind of like shepherd them back. And if you stepped in an area that was too deep, your waders just filled with flamingo poop water. And it was like, if you've ever smelled flamingos.
Oh yeah. I have met some flamingos.
It is not pleasant.
No.
And there's nothing you can do at that point. Like you can't clean it off. You just got to accept it. So that was always disgusting. And then there was one time where I had brought it was a radiated tortoise named Tater to a group of kindergartners, so like roughly like 5-6 years old. And I don't know why, but whenever I took the tortoises out, they always went to the bathroom. And I don't know about you, but before I worked with tortoises, I didn't realize like how much volume they could actually hold in their little tortoise bodies. And so these poor kids were loving Tater, and then suddenly Tater just starts walking in front of them, and just poop starts flowing, and the tortoise is walking it, spreading it across the classroom. The children are screaming. And it's like a mix of like, I think as at 5 years old, you're like horrified, but you're also like, what is that? And like, you want to poke it with a stick. So like the teacher's like trying to grab them, trying to get them to not touch it. So I like to think that was a core memory that was formed for those kids. And then I, of course, had to be the one to clean it all up.
Of course. Nice. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Yeah, of course. It was great. Anytime you have palm oil questions, or if anyone else in the world has palm oil questions, like always available to help answer them.
Love it. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, John.
So there you have it. A really cool conservation story about people from all different sides of this discussion coming together to help fix a major problem. And I love it so much. You can check out the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil online by going to rspo.org. Or find them on Instagram by going to @SupportSustainablePalmOil. And of course, don't forget to go and download the Palm Oil Scan app onto your smartphone. I'd like to take a moment to say thanks to Laura Schenk, my Red Panda level patron, and to all of my patrons. And don't forget, y'all get some bonus content from this episode, so go check out your Patreon. And remember, friends, the word credits backwards is Steiderk. The Rossifari podcast is produced, hosted, and engineered by John Rossi. Editing and fact-checking by John and Dr. Zoe Vesley Gross. Our theme song is Sevens by Nathan Burke, performed by Nathan and John. Interrupting John theme and additional voices by Taylor Isaac Gray. You can reach John directly on Instagram and Facebook at Rossifari, or by email at rossifaripod@gmail.com. Rossifari is part of the Daydreamer Media Network. Now, stop listening to me and go visit a zoo.